Hello and welcome to Coldbrook Creek, Rediscovering a Hidden Urban Stream. My name is Pete Lewandoski, and along with my wife, Mary Lewandoski, we are the co-chairs of the Coldbrook Creek community. We also live in the watershed and have lived here for quite a few decades, actually. Let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at the Coldbrook Creek watershed.
This is a map of the Coldbrook Creek watershed. This area in gray actually outlines all the land that is found in our watershed. This means that if any water that lands in this area will eventually migrate to the Coldbrook Creek and then empties into the Grand River. As part of the creek, these small, thin lines are actually where the creek is underground. The darker lines is where it is still above ground. This area over here, which you can see from the expressway, is a wetland area. So it's one of the headwaters of one of the small tributaries to the Coldbrook Creek. This area over here, number one, Reed's Lake, is probably the largest headwater area. So this number one is the southeast end of Reed's Lake. Then over here at number two, which is another smaller headwater area for the northern tributary of the creek, are three small private inland lakes that you can, they're pretty close to the belt line. Number two is a picture of West Lake.
And number three, where one and two come together here, the confluence of those two tributaries is on the property of Aquinas College. And what you're looking at here mostly is the water flowing from Fisk Lake. And right underneath this overhang of branches on the left side of the screen is where that other smaller branch comes in. Then, as Mary pointed out, these thin lines, the creek goes underground again, and you can't see it until number four here, which is part of Highland Park. The creek is above ground again there, and this is what it looks like here. This may be up to an 1/8 to a 1/4 mile stretch. This is looking west on that at that park. Then the creek flows north a little more, and you'll notice there's another tributary coming in. This is actually a separate creek. It's called Carrier Creek. Here at number 5, there's a road over there called Carrier Creek Road. And this is a smaller branch. It's a nice picture of it in winter. And then those two come together down by Belknap Park, and then they flow the rest of the way underground and finally empty into the Grand River just south of Leonard here at number 6. And that's the Coldbrook Pump House, and underneath in that cement wall, you'll see that culvert opening, and that is actually where the Coldbrook Creek comes out. So as we mentioned, we showed you a few areas above ground, but all these thin lines, as Mary mentioned, are underground. So for all these reasons, we think this is a good reason to rediscover a hidden urban creek.
So during our research, I was lucky enough to find the book written by Baxter in 1891. The title of the book was The History of the City of Grand Rapids. I became really intrigued with all of his writings, and I was really interested in the early description of the area. The map that you're seeing is actually a Finney map, and he actually did this in 2000s. But I think he does a good job of depicting what Baxter described. Up here, we have the Coldbrook Creek, which empties into the Grand River. We have the rapids, which start just north of the creek and end up down here where actually the Campaw Trading Post was here. This is the bluff, which is about 160 feet from the river. This is where Belknap Park, up that big tall hill that we see. Then along here is a really nice forested area of oak, elm, hickory, and a black ash swamp. So there was really a lot of fresh water back then. And here is a reading from Baxter I would like to read you that describes the area. By nature, this region about the rapids of Grand River was abundantly supplied with the finest and healthiest of spring water. Except on the west side flats, there were few places where it did not come bubbling and sparkling from the bosom of Mother Earth. All along the bases of the hilly elevations and well up their sides also were springs of the most excellent water, And on the lower levels, it was necessary to dig but a few feet for an ample supply for the households of the early comers.
As Mary just read, Baxter mentions the early comers, but we want to note that the area was inhabited by Native Americans at that time. This is a map of a plaque that's down at the river on the west side of the river on Pearl Street. And it's a copy of a map, an actual map from 1836. It was placed there by the Grand River Bands of Ottawa Indians, and it's commemorating the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Chicago from 1721. On this map, you can see Coldbrook on the north side. It's actually a pretty similar view to that map on the left. And you can see these couple little tributaries going all the way back to Fisk and Reed's Lake. But I think one of the reasons they really chose this map is on the west side of the Grand River. You can see it says Indian country right here, which we think was important. So we've heard some intriguing stories about how Coldbrook Creek may have played a part during this era. However, none that really fits into the focus of our presentation. So though Native American history is an important part of our area's history, our focus is going to start at the time when GR was incorporated, which was on April 5th, 1838. So lots of things we could focus on during that time frame, but we chose three major areas that we want to look at. The first one is utilizing the creek. Picture of an old pump house there. Second thing we want to look at is culverting the creek, which is putting it in tunnels underground. When did that happen? And lastly, we want to talk about people actually enjoying the creek. So let's start with the topic of utilizing Coldbrook as a source of water.
So by 1848, the downtown area was becoming really populated. So there was a better system that was needed for a water supply. A couple of guys, Canton Smith and Joseph Baxter, started an enterprise which would become the Grand Rapids Hydraulic Company. 1849, the hydraulic company was incorporated, and the charter states two purposes: conducting a plentiful supply of pure, wholesome water and to supply reservoirs for extinguishing fires. And the other purpose of the charter was the water supply should be obtained from the springs of water in and about said village, from Coldbrook Creek, from the lake or lakes from which it has its source. As time went on, they did pipe water, but they found the source further south of town. They found a spring up on that bluff that they used, and they put in some deep wells, but they never utilized the Coldbrook Creek. Then in 1870, there were big fires. And so between 49 and 70, they still did not have a water supply system that was adequate to extinguish fires. The amount of water pressure could only really put out fires on the bottom floors of the downtown buildings. The city officials and the citizens started to question the effectiveness of the hydraulic company. So 1873 became a very tumultuous year to figure out the water system in Grand Rapids. A board of public works was created in March, and within the public works was the city water works committee. And they were established to help figure out the city water supply and try to update the system. April 5th, Peter Hogan, an engineer from New York, sent a proposal to the city waterworks. And on this proposal, he wanted to bring in water from Lamberton, from Coldbrook Creek and Carrier Creek, and then pump it here and then set it up in a reservoir. No immediate steps were taken at that time, but then on July 13th, there was another disastrous fire, which could not be put out, and so the people wanted action now. So then the city waterworks submitted the Hogan plan and asked for $250,000, and by popular vote, the money was approved. Then by December, miles of pipe were laid, and they actually connected to a small reservoir, which really helped with extinguishing fires. But with the approved money, they were able to put some more of the system together in 1874. The one thing they were able to build was the pump house. This pump house is located on the river at the mouth of the Coldbrook Creek. The location gave them access to the creeks and the water. The water was pumped from the confluence of the Coldbrook and Carrier Creeks. The other part of the system that they put in was the reservoir. Up on top of the bluff, this reservoir took about 3¼ acres. This is a person up here that is cranking up a winch to open the gate to let the water out of the reservoir. By adding the reservoir, there was now enough pressure to extinguish fires in the city. So back in 75, the city actually purchased some land for the settling basin. And then this map that you're seeing here is from 1876. And so by 1876, they were able to put in the settling basin. They had the pump house and the reservoir. So this system was adequate for both drinking and extinguishing fires for about 15 years. But then by 1889, due to the migration of the city growing, they had to abandon the Coldbrook Creek, Carrier Creeks, and the settling basin due to the contamination. So though Coldbrook Creek and Carrier Creeks were abandoned as a water source by 1889, there were other ways Coldbrook was utilized. So on to ice harvesting at the headwaters.
Okay, so here's a picture of ice harvesting actually taking place, and you can see the storage house there. The ice was needed for just basic refrigeration, like we would need today. And so this started early on. In 1855, the first organized ice trade appeared on Fisk Lake, the smaller of the two lakes. And then a few decades later, there were 8 companies total. Most of them were on Reed's Lake at this time, 6 of them on Reed's Lake, 2 on Fisk Lake. In 1894, most of those companies consolidated to form the Consumers Ice Company. The reason being is that legally the companies owned the land. They were riparian by nature, the judge said. So they really had no control of where the ice, who had control of the ice on the water was up kind of in question. So these companies formed the Consumers Ice Company. Some citizens questioned if it was a monopoly or not, but they continued to exist. By 1911, there was an ice certification program put in place that was adopted through the Natural Ice Association of America. The reason being there were contamination concerns. Of course, if you want ice to keep your stuff cold, you want it to be clean. In 1916, the first ice manufacturing plant was built in Grand Rapids. It wasn't even near the lake. It was down by the river more, because the demand for natural ice, the demand for ice exceeded what the natural ice could provide. So you started manufacturing ice, and it wasn't very long then, a decade later, by 1927, it was the end of the era of natural ice harvesting, and all those ice houses were torn down. So the last topic we're going to cover now is on how the creek is utilized as a county drain.
So this is a map of the county drain. Coldbrook Creek was considered a drain, and throughout its history, the creek has been used informally and illegally as a drain for decades. We read through many accounts of it being polluted, from livestock and water, residential sewage hookups, to industries draining into it. This northeast portion of the county drain is from September 2023. This map shows that the majority of the creek is considered a county drain. So all these green lines that you're seeing is where the creek is underground, culverted, and is considered a drain. The black lines show where the creek is still above ground, up here over this area. Then these red hash marks are detention basins. And then down here, the blue lines, the Coldbrook Creek is not considered a drain, which is great news. So over here at Highland Park, originally they wanted to put that whole area underground, but there's about 800 feet that they decided to leave above ground. According to a Grand Rapids Press article from February 64, their article said they can't cover more because storm sewers may be put under too much pressure and manhole covers will pop off. So, yeah, that would not have set well. But another reason they did want to cover that is because of a hepatitis scare. Coldbrook was mentioned in the article, and they said due to illegal sewer hookups and the combined storm sewer during heavy rains. Thankfully, that combined storm sewer is now separated. So the picture that you saw a minute ago, that was the storm drain in our neighborhood. And we are part of an adopted drain program. So Pete and I try to keep it clean so there's no debris or pollution that ends up in the Coldbrook Creek. And it also helps to prevent the street from flooding. The storm drains in the Coldbrook watershed empty into the culverted creek. Pete will talk us through the culverting of the creek.
Okay, so why was the creek ever even culverted in the first place? And to get at that, we want to share a few headlines. Here's one from 1905, the Herald. City fathers have found Coldbrook Creek to be the most difficult of problems to handle. The reference here was about the creek passing beneath scores of businesses and dwellings on its way to the river. There was a picture of French's grocery store on the article, and the quote was, "When the creek overflowed, it took the foundation from under the building." So obviously a problem. Falling into Coldbrook Creek, Ambrose had a narrow escape from death by drowning. That was in 1911. It happened near Lafayette and Matilda. 3-year-old Ambrose fell in because he and some other kids were floating boats down the creek because there had been a heavy rain the night before. Fortunately, John DeWitt was in the area. He jumped in and got Ambrose out. But by that time, the boy was already unconscious and had to be resuscitated. But the article did say he should recover. Sewage is polluting Coldbrook Creek now. This article is just, it says another case of storm sewer pollution, meaning that you saw this headline quite often, and they blamed it on illegal sanitary hookups. Lastly, completing the row of houses bordering on the fill of Coldbrook Creek Gorge. That's from Halloween 1915. We'll get into more of that later, a little more closer, but I want to mention it only because you can see that they put the creek underground so they could build houses, basically. So why? Safety, health, and growth in economics, as we just mentioned. When did this happen? Well, early on, 1800s, early 1900s, the creek really flowed freely, and it mostly was just, there were bridges at railroad crossings and at road crossings. And here's a picture of the College Bridge in 1896. So not culverted at all. 1913 to 1919 is when a stretch of what I call the city edge, there were no houses at that time, and they were able to get to the culvert easier, or get to the creek easier and culvert it. So it was done a decade earlier than most other areas, probably because easier to put it in where there's no houses than to retrofit it. Then by the mid-20s, there were lots of city plans for longer culvert runs, especially between 24 and 26. Where did this occur? So a lot of the longer runs were downstream and in here between the settling basin and the river. And the next set of long runs is this railroad corridor is what I call it. From the settling basin near Belknap Park there, the railroad still runs all the way to the crossing at Michigan and Fuller, and it basically follows the creek, and that was a problematic area. Lastly, you had what was the city edge at that time, the Easttown area, Fuller and Fulton area. And so there's lots of areas that we could talk about, but just to give an example of how the culverting worked, we're going to focus on one area, and it's our neighborhood where Mary and I live. And that, first a couple pictures real quick. We've got, it gives you a sense of scale of the culverts. This is where the Carrier and Coldbrook culverts come together. And you can see that the one where they're standing is the Coldbrook. It's 12 foot wide, 8.5 foot tall. The Carrier Creek one is a little smaller. And here's another one that I thought was interesting because it shows the culvert being built as it just goes straight underneath the city waterworks building. Both of those are from 1927. Okay, so let's go back to the area I wanted to focus on here, just to give you a sense of how culverting worked. This is Fulton. This is Carlton Street. And Mary and I live here near Hope in Carlton. And this map here is two separate Sanborn maps from 1913 that I cropped and rotated to put together. So you can see where the creek used to flow out of the Aquinas property here and flowed across Krekel, which is Wilcox Park Drive now, continued on down Tennyson, which is Hope Street, crossed underneath, so there was a little culvert here at Carlton, and then continued north and northwest toward Fulton Street. You can see there are some houses, these yellow structures here, but mostly it's just platted for future housing. And our house, basically, the creek runs underneath our house in this area here. So in 1915, just 2 years later, there's a plan put out by the Board of Public Works, and I want to show you that. It basically, you can see the ghost of the stream still back there, but they show you these straight lines, which are the new culverts that are going in, those 12-foot by 8.5-foot tunnels that where the creek went in. These are very descriptive plans. You can see, I even cut some of it off to make it fit a little better, but there was just lots of technical information in there. This all happened in a relatively short amount of time. So it started October of 1914, the city council requested the estimate. And half a year later, the Board of Public Works submitted an estimate. The estimate was for $28,000, north of $28,000 at the time, which is nearly $1 million in today's money. A couple of weeks later, as the council was debating it, Alderman Baldwin said, "This culvert is a necessary public improvement and it should be paid from the flood fund." So he referred it over to the Ways and Means Committee to give it some funding. Took them but a week to come back and recommend that the culvert be constructed. And by a month later is the date on the approval plan of those plans I just showed you. So within 7 months, all this took place. And then another 5 or 6 months later, there was a GR Herald article. So in less than a year, this is the article that appeared. Built 27 residences during the past year. Fred M. Boylan puts a new face on the Coldbrook Creek Gorge. I'd like to share a little bit of that article with you. It starts out, Fred M. Boylan last week finished the last of a block of 4 houses on Hope Street. One of those houses is mine and Mary's. Those 4 are a continuation of a block of 14 on the west side of Carlton Avenue, south from Fulton to Hope Street, completing the row bordering on the fill of the Coldbrook Creek Gorge. Some idea of the work done may be gleaned from the fact that 14,000 loads of dirt were required. Okay, so the creek now has lost its identity from Edward Lowe property along its winding course northward. It concludes by saying that Mr. Boylan is a booster for Grand Rapids and an optimist as to its future, and is doing his part toward making good the claim that the Valley City is a city of beautiful homes. So here's Fred. Here's the row of houses, our neighbors on Carlton. And so they call him a booster for the city. Today, we'd probably call him a real estate developer. But at any rate, that's what went down that year. And Mary and I do appreciate our beautiful home, but we wonder what enjoyment the area could have provided had the creek remained. And actually, there are lots of ways Coldbrook Creek has been enjoyed. So let's go talk about enjoyment now of the creek. And the first thing we want to show you is this 1908 city plan map. It was prepared by the City Plan Commission, and it begins with the phrase showing existing and proposed parks and parkways. So it's actually dark green. It just shows up kind of as a dark area on your map here, but there's 2 big areas you see on the upper left part of the map. This is the Carrier Creek Gorge or Valley, and then this is the Reservoir Hill. And those were proposed parkways. And then you'll notice that all this dark area here is proposed parkways and parks, basically following the stream all the way back to the city limits, working its way back toward Fisk Lake. There's an excerpt from this plan that says Grand Rapids is even more fortunate in its natural parks land than it is in its street system. Carrier Creek, Coldbrook, Silver, and Plaster Creeks all afford natural parking at places most valuable to the people. So, moreover, these lands, which are most valuable for parks, are least valuable for building sites. So, obviously, not all these parks were realized, but there was a plan at one point, so that's interesting. But however, there are a couple places along the creek that still have parks or had parks. Mary will tell us about a couple.
So the first, sad to say, former park I want to talk to you about is Creston Park. Remember the settling basin closed up in the late 1800s. We came across a G.R. Herald article from 1908, and it talks about the old settling basin was an eyesore. So the city put this plan together to create the park. So their proposal was to put in a deep pool and a smaller wading pool. They would be filled by the water from Carrier Creek, and any of the contaminated or anytime the water became foul, they would move that water and put it into the Coldbrook Creek. In the wintertime, they would close off the pool areas and move that Carrier Creek water over into the ball field area to create skating in the winter. Though it was just a plan in 1908, by 1913, the GR Press states that the park was one of the largest pools in the city, and it is ready to be used, and it's a real beauty, becoming prettier every year. Though 10 years later, due to Carrier Creek pollution, the pool was closed, and then it was reopened in 25, utilizing the city water. But then in 1969, Creston Park was replaced by a housing development amid much controversy. The folks were kind of upset that they were losing a city park so close to home. The second park I want to talk about is Highland Park, and that is still there today. This is actually a pool from a picture of a pool from 1959 at Highland. The first pool that we read about was an article from the press in 1905. And in that article, local boys proposed to dam the Coldbrook Creek and do the necessary digging to get a good depth for swimming. Then in 1911, the city dug a 60 by 100-foot pool, filled it with diverted creek water. And according to the article, it stated, due to the prior promiscuous bathing habits of nearby residents, the city said proper bathing costumes will be required. So about 8 years later, the pool in 1919 was then closed due to an unhealthy state. This pool, this 59 picture of this pool, but it was actually built in 1942. And then there were several other pools at Highland Park over the years, but the final one was raised in 2016. Though there is no longer a pool at Highland Park, it is a well-used park with a lot of things to do, including a walk along Coldbrook Creek. Besides city parks, there are other ways the Coldbrook waters were being enjoyed.
So Reed's Lake has been well studied and talked about a lot as a popular enjoyment destination, certainly by the 1870s. This map here is actually from 1894, and everyone, I think, thinks about Ramona Park here on the west side of the lake, but there were resorts all the way around the lake, so we just thought we should at least mention that. Another way that the creek was enjoyed that Mary and I stumbled upon that we thought was definitely worth enjoying was the Coldbrook Brewery. It was opened by the Frey brothers here, pictured in front of their establishment. And it was down near the settling pond, down there on Coldbrook Street. So I'm not sure if it was named for the street or for the creek itself. They opened this in 1874, which was the same year that the pump house and reservoir were going in. So I'm not sure if they opened it or if they brewed with the creek water directly from the creek, or if by that time the reservoir was in place and they took the water from the city source. But anyway, the enjoyment of Coldbrook Creek is not only historical, it continues to this day. So let's look at this a little bit, even though this is a historical event here. The Marywood campus on East Fulton Street is part of the Dominican Sisters of Grand Rapids. The Coldbrook Creek flows through their property. They have a total property stewardship plan in place, and it includes a prairie, and they've recently expanded it. They're putting in lots of trees in a forested area along with the Friends of GR Parks. They've recently put in looked for some money to get a riparian buffer put in place around the detention pond. So lots going on there. And besides that, there's also the St. Francis Sculpture Garden and Trail, a short little trail right along the creek with a lot of artwork or art sculptures. It's a nice place to go if you ever have time. Wilcox Park over near Easttown, our neck of the woods. This dark red line you see that kind of looks like a lasso. This was put in recently by a project between Aquinas College and the Coldbrook Creek community. Worked with some good folks over there and some great students and a lot of community volunteers. And this was an area, especially down here along the creek, this north and eastern section of it, that had been neglected for a long while, years even. And so it was unused. Perhaps people were even, reluctant to go down there. Now we've cleared a path. There are wood chips, and I see people down there all the time. As a matter of fact, after we put it in just this past April. I went down there a number of times in May just to see what kind of wildlife I could see, and I saw over 60 species of birds in the month of May. So it's a nice little habitat down there. So those are other ways you can be enjoying the creek today, but there's also enjoyment possible in the future. Some daylighting opportunities. Daylighting is when you take part of the culverted creek and expose it to the daylight again. There was a report put out called the City of GR Stream Daylighting Opportunities Assessment that the city put together. This was in 2015. They suggested not many places on Coldbrook Creek, but one spot they did mention was in Highland Park, a couple of 100 feet that could be east of where the creek is exposed now. It's probably the same area that they culverted back in '64 due to that health outbreak that Mary talked about, the hepatitis outbreak. Another area perhaps is the railroad corridor that runs from Fuller in Michigan all the way down to Belknap Park area. They said this would be a wonderful opportunity for a long stretch of urban trail and creek should that railroad ever become abandoned. So that would be kind of cool. I'm not advocating that they close, but it's not heavily used. I saw some figures from 2008 that say it only carried 1,250 carloads for the whole year. Another area for the future is the Grand River Restoration. And I think a lot of us, if not all of us, have heard of this project. Here is an architect's depiction of what the area could look like. And this is the Coldbrook Pump House on the upper right part of the picture. You see where these folks are in this brown boardwalk. You can see the creek underneath there, daylighted, Coldbrook Creek. This would then be the mouth of Coldbrook Creek. From the River for All website, it says, diversion and daylighting of a portion of Coldbrook Creek demonstrates the channel's historic alignment.
So Pete just got done sharing with us the way the creek has and can be enjoyed. Turns out enjoyment of our watershed is part of the Coldbrook Creek Community Mission Statement that we developed a few years back when the group came together. The other parts of our mission statement include promoting education. So since we've been together as a watershed group, we've worked with several schools that exist in our watershed. We've gone to their schools. We've worked with them out at the Coldbrook Creek to do site work. And then in addition to working with schools, we put out a periodic newsletter to the community to let them know what's going on with the Coldbrook Creek. Another part of the mission statement is protecting the environment. What we have found a way to protect the environment is by collecting some data on the condition of the Coldbrook Creek. I think it was Trout Unlimited, right, Pete, that put in the
Yeah.
mayfly logger?
Yeah.
So we have a mayfly logger that continually puts conductivity data, and that is located at one of the branches down at Aquinas College in the Coldbrook Creek. So the other type of data we collect is at both Aquinas and Highland Park. We look at macro data twice a year. So we collect macroinvertebrates, and based on what kind we find different index species that show the health of the creek. That's done twice a year. And then quarterly, we look at both physical and chemical testing to collect that data. And we do that on a quarterly basis. And as the third part of our mission statement was providing enjoyment, which Pete just shared with us. The Coldbrook community is part of the Lower Grand River Organization of Watersheds. You can find out what we do on on the Algro website and on our Facebook page.
A little plug for ourselves there. And a plug for everybody else. A big thanks to all these organizations that we've gotten information from to work on this project. And behind each of these organizations are some great folks that helped us, some individuals. And also the History Detectives GR, certainly for inviting us to do this program, especially our liaison and our friend, Adam Oster. And of course, all you folks that took the time to listen. Thank you.